August 1945. The world was unraveling. Japan's empire, once stretched across the Pacific, was burning to ash under the relentless push of Allied forces. Cities lay in ruins, convoys were vanishing at sea, and entire battalions were surrendering by the hour. The radio waves that once carried the confident voice of the Emperor now echoed with static and broken commands. On a humid morning near the coast of Borneo, a convoy of trucks and armored transports rolled out under heavy cloud cover. Inside were over 200 Japanese prisoners of war, captured soldiers and officers escorted by a small Allied detail. Their destination was a temporary relocation camp deeper inland, a place few outside the command chain even knew existed. The road wound through thick rainforest, a green wall of vines and fog where the air felt heavy enough to breathe. Locals called the area the Sleeping Jungle, a name whispered more out of respect than superstition. But that morning, something felt wrong. The convoy's lead vehicle, an American deuce-and-a-half, reported radio interference as it passed mile marker 42. Static swallowed their transmission mid-sentence. Minutes later, all contact was lost. The last recorded message was a single phrase, visibility low, movement in the trees, then silence. When the convoy failed to arrive at its checkpoint by nightfall, it was first assumed to be mechanical trouble or a delay caused by the monsoon rains. But the next day, when reconnaissance planes flew over the supposed route, there was nothing. No trucks, no smoke, no tire tracks, not even the faint glint of metal through the canopy. It was as if the entire convoy had been swallowed whole by the jungle. The war was ending, and command had bigger concerns. Japan was preparing to surrender, and resources were stretched to their breaking point. Reports were filed, stamped pending investigation, and then buried beneath more urgent matters. Officially, the convoy was listed as lost due to enemy ambush. Unofficially, it became another ghost story of the Pacific Front. 200 men gone without a trace. No distress call, no wreckage, no survivors, just silence. In the weeks that followed, the jungle seemed to grow thicker around the empty trail. Patrols sent to retrace the convoy's path found the road almost reclaimed by vines and mud, as if nature itself had erased the evidence. The official explanation never quite fit. Local units stationed near the river crossing claimed they'd heard distant gunfire the day the convoy disappeared. Short bursts, maybe a minute at most, and then nothing. No smoke, no screams. Just the echo of gunfire rolling over the trees and fading into stillness. By the time Allied command authorized a full search, the monsoon had already begun. Torrential rain drowned any sign of passage. For nearly a month, teams hacked through the undergrowth, fighting leeches, snakes, and exhaustion, but found no trace of the missing soldiers. Then, on the 43rd day, a corporal from the Australian 2 over 33rd stumbled upon a single canteen lying half-buried near a dry creek bed. The metal was dented, the surface stained dark with what appeared to be blood. Nearby, they uncovered a crate of Japanese rations, rice, dried fish, and pickled plums still sealed but half submerged in mud. No footprints, no weapons, no bodies. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Why had supplies been left untouched? Why was there no sign of a struggle, no spent shells, no drag marks? It was as though the men had simply laid down their gear and walked into the jungle. The investigation dragged on for months, but with the war officially over, interest faded. The final report concluded, enemy engagement followed by probable environmental loss. The wording was deliberately vague, a bureaucratic way of saying no one knew what had happened. The site was marked on military maps as unsuitable terrain and quietly abandoned. Over time, the story dissolved into rumor, whispered among surviving soldiers stationed in the region. Some swore the jungle was haunted, others believed the prisoners revolted and were wiped out. But the most chilling theory came from an old guide who'd once worked that route. He said the jungle had taken them, that there were places where the forest didn't just hide the dead, it kept them. And like everything else swallowed by war, the missing convoy became another secret buried under 70 years of silence. Years passed. The world changed. But in the dense interior of Southeast Asia, time moved differently. The jungle grew thicker, swallowed old trails, and buried secrets beneath layers of moss and silence. Yet the locals never forgot what lay beyond the trees. In the scattered villages surrounding the old war zone, stories endured, passed down like cautionary lullabies. Elders spoke of strange lights drifting through the canopy at night, glowing orbs that pulsed like lanterns but never cast shadows. Hunters returned from the interior shaking, mumbling about hearing voices where no one walked. Voices speaking softly, in Japanese. Some villagers claimed to have seen figures, men in old uniforms, faces pale and sunken, rifles slung over their shoulders. But when followed, these phantoms always vanished behind the trees. They were never threatening, just watching, whispering, waiting. The ghost soldiers, they were called. On moonless nights, drumming sounds echoed faintly from the hills. Rhythmic, purposeful, no animal moved when it happened, no dogs barked. Old women would close their doors and scatter salt across the thresholds. Few dared to enter the deep interior, and those who did rarely returned the same. Some never returned at all. Ancient tribal maps, the kind drawn with charcoal and folded like sacred cloth, labeled the area near the lost convoy's last known location with a single symbol, a dark spiral surrounded by jagged marks. Beneath it, a single word, taboo. Cursed, closed ground, forbidden. One local elder, blind in one eye and wrapped in tattered robes, once told a visiting journalist that the forest had grown teeth during the war, that something had been left behind, something not meant to be found. Over time, the rumors were chalked up to superstition. Folklore, they said, war stories told by people with long memories and deeper fears, but not everyone dismissed the whispers. Especially not a woman halfway across the world, reading letters written in a language she could barely understand. It was a winter morning in Kyoto, 2015. Dr. Hane Kobayashi had returned to her late grandfather's house to sort through the last of his belongings. A historian by training, she specialized in post-war migration, how the collapse of empires scattered people across continents, and how memories of war shaped generations that followed. In a lacquered chest sealed with a rusted clasp, she found a bundle of letters, wrapped in silk and untouched for decades. The handwriting was neat, formal, and unmistakably military. Her grandfather, she'd always believed, had served in a logistics unit far from the front lines. But these letters told a different story. One caught her attention. It was dated September 1945, weeks after Japan's official surrender. That alone was odd. The letter described confusion, isolation, and a camp deep in the jungle where the rules of war no longer applied. Then came the line that changed everything. "We have been moved to Camp Yama. It is not on the map. No one speaks of it now." She read the sentence again. Camp Yama. It was a name she'd never seen in any archive, any military registry, or history book. A quick search through national records confirmed her suspicion. No official documentation existed. No location. No command structure. No unit assignments. It was a name that had been deliberately erased or never recorded to begin with. The tone of the letter grew darker near the end. Her grandfather wrote of guards abandoning their posts, strange symbols carved into tree trunks, and a sense that something old had been disturbed. His final line, "If this is my last letter, tell them it was not the jungle that took us." Hane sat in silence for a long time. Her hands trembled as she folded the letter back into its silk wrapper. She knew war left scars, but this was something deeper, something hidden. A wound time had tried to cover, but never fully healed. She had to know what Camp Yama was, and more importantly, why no one was ever supposed to find it. Weeks turned into months as Dr. Hane Kobayashi obsessed over the letters. Each word became a clue, each silence a boundary she was determined to cross. She scanned military archives in Tokyo and Washington, searching for any mention of Camp Yama. Nothing. Then, late one night, deep in the digitized archives of the Office of Strategic Services, she found something, a single reference on a faded reconnaissance report. In the corner of a 1945 intelligence map, barely legible under water stains, a hand-drawn note read, Sector 47, B, unsuitable for patrol. No details, no coordinates, no explanation. Just that warning. But the outline of the sector matched something from her grandfather's letters, the description of a mountain that folds like two hands. When she cross-referenced that with modern satellite imagery of northern Borneo, one area stood out. It was dense rainforest, an uninhabited region locals still called the closed ground. Using spectral analysis software, she adjusted the contrast, peeling away layers of vegetation through decades of overgrowth. That's when she saw it. Faint geometric shapes beneath the canopy, straight lines, rectangles, grids. Nature doesn't grow in straight lines. Whatever was there wasn't natural. She took the images to the University of Tokyo's Department of Historical Geography. The faculty dismissed it as optical illusions caused by topography. But Hane had seen enough. Her instincts screamed that something was buried there, something connected to the vanished convoy. She reached out to colleagues she trusted. Dr. Malik Rahman, a Malaysian archaeologist specializing in wartime ruins, and Tessa Ward, a British field technician known for her expertise with LiDAR scanning drones. Together they pored over the data, mapping a perimeter roughly 4 kilometers wide. Inside it were unmistakable traces of human construction uniform rows, possibly barracks or storage facilities. By early July 2016, Hane had secured limited funding and a local permit to conduct what she called a non-invasive historical survey. Officially, it was academic fieldwork. Unofficially, it was a search for ghosts. Her team assembled in Kota Kinabalu, a small crew of 5 with basic equipment, GPS units, and an old map marked only with a red X. Locals warned them not to go. The jungle there remembers, one guide said quietly. It doesn't like to be disturbed. Hane smiled politely, but her chest tightened. As their boat cut through the dark river toward the interior, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, fear and anticipation, woven together like the roots of the forest she was about to enter. The jungle greeted them with a wall of sound, cicadas screaming, branches cracking under unseen weight, the constant drip of humidity from the canopy above. Within hours of setting foot on the trail, civilization felt like a fading memory. Their guides, 2 Iban tribesmen named Aran and Joel, moved in silence, cutting through vines with machetes while the researchers followed, heavy with packs and doubt. Every few miles, they marked coordinates, cross-checking the old OSS grid with modern maps. The numbers lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. First, it was the wire-thin, rusted fencing woven through the roots of strangler figs. It looped aimlessly through the underbrush, disappearing into the soil like veins of corroded metal. Then came the coins. Japanese sen, worn smooth by time, scattered near a dry ravine. Not trade currency, Malik murmured. These were carried by soldiers. By the third day, the canopy thickened, choking out nearly all sunlight. The air grew heavy with the scent of rot and old iron. Hane's GPS flickered, showing static instead of coordinates. Tessa checked the batteries twice. Brand new, fully charged. Still nothing. Magnetic interference, she said quietly. But from what? That evening they camped near a narrow ridge. In the distance, through the fog, something unnatural jutted from the slope, angled, symmetrical. Aran froze when he saw it. You said we were only mapping, he whispered. That is not a place for the living. At dawn, Hane led the team toward the structure. Vines hung from it like curtains, but the shape beneath was unmistakable, a metal gate, nearly intact, standing alone in the wilderness. Its frame was stamped with Japanese characters, half-eaten by rust. Malik brushed the surface clean with trembling hands. The words became clear, Camp Yama. The gate stood open, its hinges locked in place by corrosion. Beyond it, a path led downhill, vanishing into mist. Hane stared into that fog, heart hammering in her chest. 70 years of silence, 70 years of rumor, and now the entrance to something that wasn't supposed to exist. The jungle was quiet now, too quiet. Even the insects had stopped. The gate groaned faintly as they passed through, vines brushing their shoulders like fingers warning them back. A narrow footpath led downhill, partially obscured by fallen branches and decades of leaf litter. Then, without warning, the jungle parted. The air changed cooler, stiller. The trees thinned into a wide clearing, and there, rising from the earth like ghosts, stood the remains of Camp Yama. Rows of collapsed wooden buildings sagged under the weight of time and tangled roots. Barracks lined the western edge, their walls bowed and blackened with mildew. A central mess hall, its roof caved in, stood at the heart of the compound. And towering above it all, barely holding together, was a rusted watchtower, its skeletal frame bent but intact, pointing skyward like a broken finger. No one spoke as they stepped into the clearing. It felt like trespassing. Tessa snapped a photo, then lowered her camera. "It's all still here," she whispered. "They never dismantled it." Inside the nearest barracks, sunlight slanted through broken slats, illuminating rows of sleeping mats, still rolled with care. Tin cups sat on overturned crates. Empty ration tins lined a makeshift shelf. In one corner, Malik found a pair of boots, their leather eaten through but still upright, as if waiting for a man who never returned. Rusted rifles leaned against the wall, trigger guards fused with time. But it was the small things that haunted them most. Folded paper cranes strung on thread, a toothbrush in a chipped ceramic cup, a child's drawing pinned to the inside of a footlocker. Then came the diaries. Stacked neatly inside a rusted ammo box were journals leather-bound, thin, some still legible. Most were written in Japanese, the ink faded but intact. One dated entry simply read, "August 23rd, we are still here, no orders, no rescue, only the forest remains." It was as if time had folded in on itself. The camp hadn't been destroyed. It had been abandoned mid-sentence. A chapter left unfinished, swallowed by the jungle and forgotten by the world. Hane stood at the center of the compound, staring up at the rusted tower. The silence pressed in from all sides. She thought of her grandfather's final letter, the warning he had written. She now understood something he never lived to explain. This place wasn't just hidden, it had been sealed by time itself. The officers' quarters sat apart from the rest of the camp, a squat concrete structure with reinforced walls and a heavy steel door that had rusted into its frame. It took all 5 of them and 2 crowbars to wrench it open. Inside, the air was cooler, untouched by sunlight. Dust hung like fog in the narrow beams of light that slipped through cracked vents. A desk stood at the far end, overturned and half-buried beneath fallen plaster. Files were scattered across the floor, damp, rotted, their ink smudged into oblivion. But one drawer had remained sealed, protected by rust rather than destroyed by it. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a thick, leather-bound journal. It was old, but intact. The front page was stamped with kanji. Personnel ledger, Camp Yama. Hane carefully turned the pages. The handwriting was meticulous. The first entries listed guards, engineers, medical staff. Then, pages of POWs, names, ranks, origin points. Dozens, then hundreds. Some were crossed out with single black lines. Others were annotated. Transferred, deceased, escaped. But near the end of the list, one name was circled in red. Unlike the tidy handwriting before it, this entry was messy, rushed. The name, Lutengi Sato. Next to it, scrawled in the margin. He knows the truth. The ink was darker here, fresher than the rest, possibly written days or even hours before the camp was abandoned. Below the note, a reddish smear trailed down the page. Tessa leaned closer. "That's blood," she said. No one contradicted her. Behind the desk, Malik found a dark stain on the wall, just above floor level. There were scratches there, deep grooves etched into the concrete, like someone had tried to claw their way out or mark their final moments. In the corner of the room was a wooden trunk, its contents damp but identifiable. A ceremonial officer's sword, a bundle of letters tied with string, and a small photograph. 5 men in uniform standing proudly at the camp gate. One of them was Lieutenant Kenji Sato. His eyes seemed to stare past the camera, his expression unreadable. "We need to find out what he saw," Hane whispered. The forest outside creaked as wind pushed through the canopy. Somewhere in the distance, a bird screamed high, sharp, unnatural. And for the first time, the team began to understand. Camp Yama wasn't a prison. It was a graveyard with secrets buried too deep for even war to remember. Until now. The command building was the most fortified structure in Camp Yama, thick concrete walls, barred windows, and a blast door that had rusted shut over decades of monsoon and silence. It took hours to cut their way inside. The air was foul, heavy with mildew and something older, more metallic. The interior was almost completely intact, preserved like a bunker frozen in time. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their contents swollen and unreadable. An operations table stood at the center, covered in curling maps and yellowed reports. At the far end, a narrow door led to the radio room. Inside, a field transmitter sat silent beneath a blanket of dust, its antenna long collapsed. Cables snaked across the floor, still plugged into an auxiliary power unit. Tessa inspected the equipment. This setup could have transmitted across the island, she muttered, running her fingers across the dials. If they had power and someone left to use it. Near the radio was a small soot-stained desk. On it lay a charred piece of paper, curled at the edges from fire, but mostly intact. The characters were Morse code, neat dots and dashes, burned into the page by heat and desperation. Hane, hands trembling, began to translate. They turned on each other. No way out. We are not alone. She read the line aloud. No one spoke. Malik turned to the far wall, where the remains of a message had been scrawled in chalk. Symbols repetitive, angular, some almost tribal, others more geometric. A date was written beneath them. 31 August 1945, over 2 weeks after Japan's surrender. The realization struck hard. Camp Yama didn't dissolve the day the war ended. It lingered. Something kept them there. Something kept them silent. Malik found a blood-stained headset still plugged into the transmitter. Someone tried to call for help, he said. They just never finished the message. No logs remained. No recordings. Just one final, aborted broadcast and the echo of fear embedded in the scratches along the desk's edge, where fingers had once clutched too tightly. They turned on each other. No way out. We are not alone. Hane looked up from the message. This wasn't just abandonment, she said. Something happened here. Something worse than surrender. And with that, the forest outside seemed to exhale, branches creaking like bones under pressure. Beyond the main camp, a trail of broken fencing and torn earth led them to the edge of a ravine. Joel, one of their guides, paused. His voice dropped to a whisper. "This is a place of endings," he said. No one laughed. There, half hidden beneath thick moss and creeping vines, they found the first signs, deep gouges in the ground, as if dozens of boots had churned the earth in panic. Further in, a concrete bunker lay partially collapsed, its roof caved under a fallen tree. Inside, the air was still. Scratches lined the inner walls, long, frantic gouges. Some were high up, others low to the ground. Malik knelt beside them, running his hand along the markings. "These aren't just from tools," he said. "Some were made with fingernails." There were no bodies in the bunker, only remnants. A shredded uniform, a cracked helmet, a pair of glasses, lenses still intact but frame twisted. Near the exit, Hane found a torn page from a journal. The ink had run, but 2 words were still readable. No sleep. 200 meters further, the jungle opened into a clearing. There, uneven mounds rose from the soil. Bamboo crosses, weathered and brittle, marked the graves. Some were broken. Some had been deliberately pushed over. Tessa counted 14 in the first row. Behind them were more, arranged with rigid, military symmetry. Malik began excavating the nearest site. Beneath just a foot of soil, they found bones shallow, hastily buried. Skulls with fractured jaws, ribs snapped inward, hands clutching at the earth. There were no signs of execution, no bullets, no restraints. These weren't battlefield deaths. Starvation, Malik murmured. Infection, maybe even blunt trauma. Some of these wounds are from fists, not weapons. It was as if the camp had devoured itself, A small satchel was found near one grave. Inside, a rusted spoon, a photograph of a woman holding a child, and a final note written in Japanese. "Forgive me, there was no light left." Hane stepped back. The forest pressed in around them, humid and unmoved. The mass grave was silent now, but it hadn't always been. The final days of Camp Yama weren't orderly, weren't strategic. They were chaotic, violent, a collapse from within. And somewhere, deep in the trees beyond the graves, something still watched. They found it buried beneath a pile of rotted canvas near the infirmary, the leather cover swollen from moisture but miraculously intact. When Hane unwrapped it, the smell of mildew and decay filled the air. The first page was in English, written in a hurried, looping hand. The title simply read, "Field Journal, Sergeant David Harland, 3rd Allied Medical Corps, an Allied medic." The realization hit like a jolt. He wasn't supposed to be there. This camp, by every known record, had been exclusively Japanese. Yet here was proof that one foreigner had lived among them, or, at the very least, survived longer than anyone else. The entries began clearly, dated the 30th of July 1945. Harland described being taken from a captured hospital convoy and forced to treat both wounded POWs and guards at Camp Yama. "The jungle's closing in," one entry read. "Supplies running low, fever spreading fast. But the guards won't let us leave. They say the war's over for everyone except us." The tone shifted by mid-August. The handwriting became erratic, the lines uneven. "They're hearing things," he wrote. "Voices at night, sounds that move between the trees. Men wake up screaming, swearing someone whispered their names." Then, on August 22nd, they found Corporal Ito hanging by the mess hall, his eyes covered with cloth. They said the forest told him to do it. By early September, the entries devolved into fragments, short, terrified confessions. "No rations left. They burn incense at night. Prayers I've never heard before." Symbols painted on the walls in blood and charcoal. A sketch followed, concentric circles filled with sharp, geometric markings. Not Shinto, not Buddhist, something older, darker. The final pages were nearly illegible, smudged by water and trembling hands, but one passage stood out, underlined twice. "They believe the forest is alive, that it speaks to them through the dead. Tonight they plan something, an offering. I can hear them chanting outside. If this is found, know that they weren't mad. They were convinced." The last entry was dated September 3rd, 1945 weeks after Japan's surrender. The ink trailed off mid-sentence. "They're calling me to the cave." Hane stared at the final line, her heart pounding. The medic's words painted a picture of desperation descending into madness, or perhaps belief. Either way, the journal confirmed one terrifying truth. The soldiers of Camp Yama hadn't just died. They'd crossed some invisible line between survival and something far darker. It was Joel who found the tunnel. A faint depression behind the barracks wall, half hidden by moss and collapsed timber. The air seeping from it was cold, too cold for the tropical heat. They cleared the debris, revealing a narrow passage reinforced with bamboo struts and rusted wire. It sloped downward into darkness. Hane hesitated. Every instinct told her not to go, but the last line of Harland's journal echoed in her mind. "They're calling me to the cave." They entered with headlamps and cameras. The tunnel stretched for nearly 50 meters before opening into a vast limestone chamber. The walls glistened with moisture, but beneath the sheen, carvings covered every surface, symbols, identical to those in Harland's sketches. Circles, crossed lines, spirals intersecting like tangled roots. At the center of the cavern stood a crude altar built from stacked ammunition crates and pieces of corrugated metal. Upon it lay fragments of bone, charred, brittle, and arranged in careful patterns. Malik knelt beside the remains. "Human," he whispered. "Multiple individuals. Burned post-mortem." The air thickened with a smell of ash and iron. Scattered around the altar were objects that didn't belong. Broken helmets, a canteen, a torn flag blackened with soot. Dozens of melted candles had fused into wax puddles along the ground. And on the far wall, painted in something dark and organic, a message in Japanese: "To feed the forest, we must return to it." Tessa raised her camera, hands shaking. "This wasn't just worship," she said. "It was ritual." Hane approached the altar slowly. Among the ashes, she found a small metal tag engraved with an Allied insignia, the medics. She turned it over in her palm, realizing Harland hadn't been a witness to the ceremony. He had been part of it, or sacrificed to it. The team stood in silence, the beam of their lights trembling against the ancient carvings. The walls seemed to breathe, condensation pulsing as if with a heartbeat. Then, faintly, from somewhere deeper in the cave, came a sound, a low, rhythmic echo. Not wind, not water. It sounded like chanting. The deeper they dug, both in the jungle and in the archives, the clearer it became. Camp Yama hadn't just been lost, it had been deliberately buried. After returning from Borneo, Dr. Kobayashi submitted a detailed report to multiple historical and military institutions, hoping to open a formal inquiry into the camp's existence. What she received instead was silence. Weeks turned into months. Emails went unanswered. Archive requests were delayed, then denied. One contact within the U.S. National Archives, a retired analyst named George Lanning, finally agreed to speak, off the record. Over coffee in a quiet Arlington cafe, he slid a yellowed document across the table. It was dated the 14th of February 1946, marked eyes only. The header read, Directive 1337, C, Southeast Asia Theater, Post, Conflict Asset Containment. Line 3 stopped her cold. Camp Yama file classified indefinitely. No recovery or follow-up to be authorized without direct command approval. All inquiries to be closed. Hane looked up. Why? Lanning leaned back, his face unreadable. Whatever happened there, someone didn't want it followed. Ever. Over the next few weeks, she uncovered more inconsistencies. A missing Air Patrol report from 1945, redacted transcripts of intercepted Japanese communications, a warehouse inventory from Tokyo listing a full medical corps assigned to Camp Yama, none of whom were ever accounted for post-war. Allied intelligence, it seemed, had known about the camp's existence. They just chose to erase it. The question wasn't just what happened at Camp Yama, but who decided it should stay forgotten. Rumors of psychological experiments, chemical exposure, or rogue cult activity swirled in fringe circles. But to Hane, the most chilling theory was the simplest. Perhaps the silence wasn't to protect the living, but to contain what the dead had become. At an international war symposium, she presented her findings. Some scholars applauded, others called it speculative fiction. But one veteran, now in his 90 seconds, approached her afterward with trembling hands. He'd been stationed in Southeast Asia in 1946. "I remember whispers," he said. "They said the jungle took them, and that it would take anyone who looked too hard." And just like that, he turned and walked away. When the remains were flown to a forensic lab in Kuala Lumpur, the process began. DNA extraction, bone dating, cross-referencing with old Japanese military records. Within weeks, 22 individuals were positively identified, most of them guards and junior officers, all presumed dead for decades. The Japanese government was notified. Letters were sent to next of kin. For many, it was the first confirmation that their loved ones had not simply deserted or disappeared into post-war chaos. They had died alone, forgotten, and buried in a jungle that never gave back what it took. Some families had moved on, long ago accepting loss. Others had held on to hope, clinging to rumors of soldiers living in exile, hidden somewhere deep in Asia. A few believed their sons had started new lives, perhaps with new names and quiet regret. Now, those beliefs shattered under the weight of forensic certainty. In Hiroshima, an elderly woman named Keiko Sato wept as she held the identification tag of her brother, Lieutenant Kenji Sato, the man circled in red in the ledger found at Camp Yama. She had kept his room untouched since 1945. His uniform still hung in the closet, His photo still sat on the family altar. "I prayed he had escaped," she said, "but now I know he didn't." In Tokyo, a public memorial was held in a quiet corner of Yasukuni Shrine. A plaque was placed for the 22 soldiers. No grand ceremony, no politicians, just grieving families, standing in silence as incense curled toward the sky. Some wept, some stayed stone-faced. One man, the grandson of a sergeant identified in the mass grave, laid down a single photograph and whispered, "I forgive you." But not everyone found peace. A group of families issued a formal complaint to the Japanese Ministry of Defense, demanding to know why they were never told about Camp Yama, why there were no repatriation efforts, why the site had been forgotten, and why Allied records had been sealed. Back in Malaysia, Dr. Kobayashi sat with a stack of returned letters, some thanking her, others cursing her. "You gave us answers," one read, "but you also gave us nightmares. Relief, grief, fury. There is no single emotion that comes with uncovering the dead. Only a quiet, lingering ache that what was once hidden is now exposed and still, somehow, remains unspeakable." Dr. Hane Kobayashi stood once more at the edge of the clearing, the overgrowth now trimmed back, the old rusted gate of Camp Yama tagged with bright red markers by the preservation team. The jungle felt quieter than it had before, but not silent. Never silent. Birds chirped from high in the canopy. The wind whispered through branches. The forest always spoke in fragments. And after everything she'd uncovered, Hane still wasn't sure if it was whispering warnings or secrets. It had been nearly a year since they unearthed the site. The Malaysian government, in cooperation with Japanese and international agencies, declared Camp Yama a protected war heritage zone. Plans were drawn to build a small memorial, a visitor's path, a digital archive. But deep inside, Hane wasn't sure the camp wanted to be remembered. The remains had been removed, the shrines respectfully disassembled. But the symbols remained, etched into limestone, refusing to fade. Even the jungle, it seemed, had grown around the camp in a shape that suggested it wasn't just hiding something, it had been shielding it, protecting it, or perhaps containing it. She sat alone near the remains of the mess hall, her journal open, a pencil hovering above the page. The others had left for the day, and only the hum of distant cicadas remained. She looked toward the jungle's edge, where the trail to the cave disappeared behind twisted branches. She hadn't been back inside since that first trip. None of them had. The chanting they'd heard still echoed in her memory, though no recording had captured it. No proof. Just the feeling that something in those depths still lingered. What really happened at Camp Yama? How did a fully functioning military outpost collapse into starvation, violence, and ritual? Did they lose their minds, or did they find something the war was never meant to touch? And who gave the order to bury it all, to silence every question before it could be asked? Hane flipped back through her notes, stopping at the medic's final journal entry. They weren't mad. They were convinced. That's what haunted her most. She rose to leave, casting one last glance at the crooked watchtower above. The sun cut through the trees in long golden shafts, but the shadows remained deep, too deep. And just before she stepped onto the path back to camp, the wind picked up behind her, carrying with it a faint sound. A whisper. In Japanese. She turned, but nothing moved. The jungle was watching. And it wasn't done telling its story. This story was intense. But this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.